Hi, we're continuing our sermon series on the book of Samuel. This past weekend in service, we wrapped up 1 Samuel. But before we get into 2 Samuel, I wanted to take a look at the last chapter of 1 Samuel, specifically the death of Saul. Now, Saul is a man who is driven by his fears and insecurities, and he has a tragic ending to his story. And if you read 1 Samuel 31 carefully, you get to the point in the story where Saul, knowing that he's going to be captured by the Philistines, asks his armor bearer to kill him, which is really interesting, and it parallels something we saw earlier in Scripture. If you remember from our sermon series last summer, the book of Judges, Judges 9 is all about Abimelech, who is this unrighteous man who wants to make himself king over Israel. You may remember he's the son of Gideon, who was a righteous judge. But Abimelech wants to make himself king, and so he plots and he schemes and he kills his brothers and kills most of a town to gain power. And in Abimelech's story, we see that as he's besieging a tower, a woman drops a stone on top of his head and it crushes his head. But he doesn't die immediately. Instead, he asks his armor bearer to kill him. And so you see this really interesting parallel between Saul asking his armor bearer and Abimelech asking his armor bearer both to kill them. And it's this fascinating look at these two unrighteous kings of Israel and the tragic ends that they kind of bring upon themselves. What's additionally interesting about this is when you think back through the story of Samuel, you think back to the dynamic of Saul and of David, you start to pick up the details. Who was Saul's original armor bearer? Well, if you go back and read the story, it was David. And we see in the story of Saul's death that the armor bearer is unwilling to kill King Saul. Instead, Saul has to kill himself, and then ultimately the armor bearer dies as well. What you see in that is this fascinating parallel and kind of a replaying of the story of the dynamic of David and Saul, where David, this righteous king of Israel who's being brought up by Yahweh, is unwilling to harm the Lord's anointed, Saul, the king of Israel at the time. We see in the story with David cutting his rope, he was unwilling to kill Saul. And then when he took Saul's spear, he was unwilling to kill Saul. And now we see one final time this acting out of David through the proxy of this armor bearer being unwilling to kill the Lord's anointed. And it again points to us this parallel of lives between David and Saul. While this is happening, David is fighting the Amalekites and having victory, and he's going to parade the spoils of war all around Judah. And Saul is going to meet his tragic end here, and it says the Philistines will mutilate his body, and then they'll parade his armor and his weapons all around Philistia. So it's this really fascinating and tragic look at the end of 1 Samuel as we get ready to go into David's reign and kind of the tragedy and the struggle of his family. It's one final look and a warning, I think, for those of us who read Scripture today of what can happen when we're driven by insecurity, when we're driven by our fears, when we try to consolidate power for ourselves, and most importantly, when we don't live within the will of God. And so I hope that this was a blessing to you, and I hope as we get ready to go into 2 Samuel, you'll make a renewed effort to read with us as we make our way through this awesome book.